But continuing with the unresolved matters in 1993 that are still a consequence to 9/11, even although we spent considerable time covering the profiles of the Trade Center bombing conspirators, there are quite a few things overlooked in the early news coverage on the investigation, added with peculiar circumstances in the way these suspects, even though guilty in a conspiracy to carry out terrorist bombings, were often portrayed in their motivation, plannings, knowledge, and capability disproportionately within the media. Like Mohammed Salameh, after the attacks, investigators had believed in the probability due to his ancestral region that he may have been related to Ali Hassan Salameh, the so-called Red Prince of the Black September, intricately behind the 1972 Munich massacre. Salameh is currently an inmate in ADX Supermax. The Palestinian, Nadel Ayad, why did he take credit for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing as the Liberation Army 5th Battalion?
The letter claiming responsibility for the World Trade Center explosion is raising new questions tonight. The letter, sent to the New York Times 4 days after the blast, was reportedly written by one of the 4 men arrested in connection with the bombing. But the president of the Arab-American Relations Committee, MT Mehdi, says the letter was not written by a Muslim fundamentalist or a religious person. He says the letter didn't make the appropriate references to God.
With the title incorporating Liberation Army would be more indicative of an Arab revolutionist struggle or resistance movement rather than exclusively Islamic. Perhaps that also might explain why the ripped-up photo of Ayad in the garbage outside his home, posing with a grenade beneath the Palestinian flag, would be more representative of rebellions or uprisings in the First Intifada, 1987 to 1993 in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and within Israel at that time, and certainly not demonstrative of anything to do with fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. Nadel Ayad is apparently serving his life sentence in a federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. And then there's Mahmoud Abu Halima, the Red. Again, one of the few who was able to flee just days after the bombing. He was later apprehended in Egypt by authorities and found in possession of a book on the rapid demolition and destruction of buildings in his residence before being extradited back to the U.S. It's highly suggested from investigative authorities on the matter that Abu Halima was the only conspirator and getaway vehicle for Nosair during the Kahana assassination, since he was also a taxi driver. However, in 2010, while investigative reporter Peter Lance was writing an article in Imad Salem for Playboy, he had also discovered that FBI interviewed El Sayed Nosair in 2005, where he had stated that he was accompanied by 2 conspirators as his getaway for the Meir Kahana assassination, one of them being Mohammed Salameh, and the other being the livery driver Bilal Al-Qazi. Furthermore, Lance had also learned that year from a series of standard FBI interviews known as 302 memos within the trade bomb investigation that Nadel Ayad admitted to being the getaway driver as part of a trio that carried out the assassination of Mustafa Shalabi, with both Salameh and Al-Qazi. From Lance's further analysis on what the FBI truly uncovered about Al-Qazi leads him to believe that Bilal was the actual New York ringleader in the Trade Center bombing, not Mahmoud Abu Halima. But regardless of Abu Halima's true role, in 1981 he first moved to West Germany from Egypt. Time magazine did a whole spread about him, as well as the gist of the 1993 conspirators on October 4th, 1993. In the Time magazine article, Abu Halima later recounted that in Germany he had lived a life of corruption, girls, drugs, you name it. After being denied political asylum there in 1982, he quickly married a nurse from Munich named Renee Soika, so he could remain in the country. She had the impression that he had worked in some kind of underground movement from the frequent groups of Egyptian guests visiting their apartment discussing politics in Arabic, but suspected nothing criminal. Unwilling to convert to Islam, Abu Halima then divorced Soika 3 years later, while eventually marrying another woman named Marianne Weber in a Muslim ceremony, and then eventually moving together to Brooklyn in 1986. He is serving his life sentence at ADX. And there's a lot of mystery behind Iyad Ishmael, who was 23 years old at the time of the Trade Center bombing and known to Nadel Ayad as Rashid's friend. In October 1989, Ishmael came to the United States on a student visa, enrolling in an intensive English language program at Wichita State University in Kansas. Ishmael's co-workers and acquaintances recalled him as not particularly bright, nor did he have any strong political or religious feelings. Very westernized, he liked hamburgers and cowboy movies, and he was briefly married to a tall blonde American beauty, as he described to his family. However, if there ever became a motive for Ishmael's willingness to carry out a terrorist attack as a false pretext against Saddam and Iraq, then Ishmael would certainly become the candidate with an axe to grind by 1991. Ishmael's father had been an operator at the Kuwaiti National Petroleum Company. He was able to support Ishmael financially, but after the Iraq invasion, the entire family left to Jordan. The PLO supported Saddam at that time, as did many Palestinians living in Kuwait. After the war, Kuwait did not generally allow Palestinians to return, so Ishmael's father thus lost his job, and in Jordan, it was impossible for him to earn what he had been making in Kuwait. Without his father's support, Ishmael could not pay his tuition and he dropped out of school. He left Kansas in 1991 for New York to stay with an uncle and cousin, both cab drivers. After a brief stint driving a taxi, he moved later that year to Dallas to work at a restaurant owned by a family friend. In December 1992, he was contacted by Ramzi Yousef, with whom he relocated to New York City on February 22, 1993 to begin preparing the Trade Center bomb. Ishmael was traceable through phone records made between him and Yousef, and also being on the same passenger manifest once fleeing after the Trade Center bombing, meaning that Yousef didn't return to Pakistan afterward as simply expressed in the official narrative, that instead he first went directly to Jordan before returning home to Pakistan. Ishmael is currently serving his life sentence in Lee U.S. Penitentiary in Pennington Gap, Virginia. And then when it comes to the most clearest organizer for the Trade Center bombing, surprisingly, the Egyptian-born Palestinian El-Said Nosair was born in 1955 in Port Said, Egypt, and immigrated to the United States in 1981, first moving to Pennsylvania working odd jobs, and eventually moving to New Jersey in 1985. He became an American citizen in 1989. He is serving his sentence at the Big Sandy U.S. Penitentiary in Kentucky. There's still a little bit more to cover about him, but regarding his cousin Ibrahim Al-Gabrowny, who has a limited sentence, his current whereabouts as far as where he's incarcerated is unknown. And we've certainly covered all the important areas regarding the landmark plot bombers, or those close to the blind sheik's inner circle. However, when it comes to all the 1993 conspirators' legal defense, aside for William Kunstler, who passed away in 1995, the follow-up stories with attorney Lynne Stewart and Ahmed Abdel Sattar defending and translating for the blind sheik afterwards are somewhat interesting. In the wake of 9/11 and the national security state, Stewart herself was convicted on charges of conspiracy and providing material support to terrorists in 2005, and sentenced to 28 months in prison. Her felony conviction led to her being automatically disbarred. She was convicted of helping pass messages from Sheikh Rahman with assistance from Sattar to his followers in Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, already designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Journeyman Pictures produced a 19-minute documentary in 2003, The Lawyer and the Blind Sheik, USA, about Stewart's ongoing legal battle then. She was resentenced on July 15, 2010 to 10 years in prison in light of her perjury at trial. She served her sentence at Federal Medical Center, Carswell, a federal prison in Texas. Stewart was released from prison on December 31, 2013, on a compassionate release order because of her terminal breast cancer diagnosis. She passed away on March 7, 2017. Sattar is a rather bold character. In 1999, on a PBS Frontline special, Hunting Bin Laden, formerly known as The Terrorist and the Superpower, Sattar said,
The American government don't get it.
They don't get it.
No. You can kill Osama bin Laden today or tomorrow. You can arrest him and put him on trial in New York or in Washington or whatever. This will end the problem? No. Tomorrow you will get somebody else.
Of course, as one might expect in mainstream documentary filmmaking, his interview is incomplete and edited. According to the previous transcript, Sattar continues to say, his name probably will be different. Abdullah or Muhammad, it's not going to end until you take a hard and a good look at your policies in the Islamic world and the Muslim world. As long as you're supporting dictators like Mubarak, as long as you're giving aid to regimes that are worse to their people than Saddam Hussein, things will get ugly, and you cannot control the emotion of people when you are tortured in Egyptian prison by an American-trained Egyptian officer.
It's not a secret that the American government, has one enemy, is the Islamic movement all over the world. Whether it's armed struggle or by peaceful means. And you can see it. You can see it from Algeria, you can see it to Afghanistan.
The United States is at war?
Yes, to a certain extent, yes.
With Islam?
Yes.
Later on, it's reportedly alleged through Imad Salem himself and or through wired recordings up to 1993 that Sattar offered ideas and to involve himself in a plan to send a mail bomb to target FBI agent John Antisev. Sattar was charged on April 7, 2002 for material support, money laundering, criminal conspiracy, and making false statements pertaining to Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, and was sentenced for 24 years with 5 years supervised release. He was just freed on January 14, 2022. But continuing on with incarceration and concerns over issues regarding communication and publicity posed by terrorists and as national security threats, 3 of the Trade Center bombing conspirators, Salameh, Abu Halima, and Ayad, have published statements or have been allowed to write up 90 letters from inside Supermax prison after 9/11, encouraging other fellow extremists around the world to terminate the infidels because Muslims don't have an option other than jihad, asking others to bring them happiness so they could die as martyrs in prison. It was said they were exhorting or helping recruit would-be terrorists from inside an American prison. One of Salameh's letters, in which he calls Osama bin Laden the hero of my generation, was published in a newspaper in July 2002, but this did not result in any new security attempts to stop other letters out of ADX until 2005. But what exactly did Salameh mean by his generation? Considering how this story or fundamentalist reaction began in the state of Colorado as a result of Sayyid Qutb's experiences of America in the 1950s, the story, or road to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, consequently before 9/11, also ends there, as most of the main 1993 conspirators, as well as some later involved in the East Africa Embassy's bombings, are being held at Supermax ADX prison in Florence, Colorado. Few other conspirators have been transferred or are being held elsewhere, as with examples already aforementioned. But in regards to research benefit and unfinished puzzling, looking at all of these 1993 suspects now incarcerated in comparison to the September 11th conspiracy are actually more interesting cases, simply being that on the official scale, most of the criminal conspirators involved in 1993 are alive, whereas for 9/11, the accounted ones are dead. And when comparing who's incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that's said to be linked to 9/11, already clouded in controversy and saturated with mixed emotions, only helps to overshadow 1993, when for deeper truth seekers, there is less of an uphill battle getting access to answers, as the bombing conspirators and other so-called Al-Qaeda members are all mainly housed at the ADX Supermax prison in Colorado, where not only Ramzi Yousef and conspirators are being held, so is the alleged 20th 9/11 hijacker, Zacarias Moussaoui, and the infamous shoe bomber, Richard Reed.
We've learned that Reed, seen here in his cell, is in a special wing for terrorists called H Unit. Others include Zacarias Moussaoui, who wanted to be one of the 9/11 hijackers, and Wadi El-Hage, Osama bin Laden's former private secretary. We're told that there have been frequent hunger strikes among the Islamic terrorist inmates inside Supermax, and to keep the inmates alive, there are often force feedings. That's when an inmate is restrained and liquid nourishment is poured down a tube in his nose. We're told that there have been a dozen hunger strikers, and one of them used to be Osama bin Laden's secretary.
Not only was El-Hage bin Laden's secretary and an East Africa Embassy bombing conspirator, he's another Lebanese Al-Qaeda militant like the supposed Flight 93 hijacker Ziad Jarrah of the Hamburg cell, coming from Lebanon Christian education backgrounds. Other than his activities prior in the Mid-Southwest pertaining to the Afghan Services Bureau, what makes El-Hage more significant out of any of the 1993 or 9/11 conspirators is that he outnumbers them many years ahead, becoming a U.S. resident going as far back as 1978. But interestingly, El-Hage met with 2 other Al-Qaeda operatives from Germany in the island of Cyprus to conduct a transaction in purchasing this ship for Osama bin Laden in 1994. One of the operatives was Sadiq Walid Awad, who also had calls traced to Kenya from where he lived in Hamburg in 1997. Less is known about Awad, but El-Hage identified him as an Iraqi Al-Qaeda operative with German and Israeli passports. How does an Al-Qaeda operative get an Israeli passport? But unlike Awad, where no public photo exists of him, mainly the other individual involved in the transaction who met with El-Hage is the Syrian Mamoun Darknazali, who is a founding member of the Hamburg cell and was arrested in Germany 2004 on a Spanish warrant but freed in 2005 by a ruling from the German Federal Constitutional Court. Darknazali is under sanction as affiliate or supporter of Al-Qaeda by the UN, the European Union, and the U.S. Treasury as a specially designated global terrorist. His company, Darknazali Export-Import Sonderposten, in Hamburg as until recent, is still listed there. He walks as a free man in Germany and has been under constant surveillance by the authorities there. Although being different nationalities with the 3 9/11 hijackers, Egyptian, Lebanese, and United Arab Emirates, added with the 4th being the Yemeni Ramzi bin al-Shibh, Ultimately, the rest of the September 11th attacks, or 9/11, is mainly perceived within the American lexicon as a crime committed by Saudi Arabians because of bin Laden and the bulk of 9/11 hijacker nationalities. But for the rest of the Hamburg cell members, they were all mainly of Moroccan descent, and they are subjects that should not be overlooked. But they don't necessarily have any previous activity noted for, as far as going back into the early 90s or 80s, like the Syrian Darknazali. But there's another Syrian who is also considered a Hamburg cell founder and has been labeled as Mohammed Atta's recruiter, Mohammed Haydar Zamar. Zamar was arrested in October of 2001 in Morocco, but instead of being deported to the US or Germany, he was secretly sent to Syria for indefinite detention. It was confirmed in 2005 that federal officers of the German Bundeskriminalamt, the BKA, had at least on one occasion interrogated Zamar in Syria under secrecy and unknown conditions. Zamar was then released as part of a prisoner exchange between the Islamist Syrian rebel group Ahrar al-Sham and the Syrian government in September of 2013. He was seen a year later in a home video behind an ISIS flag listening to a speech by the number 2 in the Islamic State in Aleppo, Syria. He was recaptured by members of the Kurdish People's Protection Units in March 2018 near Deir al-Zor, eastern Syria. He is currently being held in prison in Qamishli, northern Syria, from where he's given interviews to the Washington Post and Der Spiegel in 2018. The status of these Syrian intrigues from Germany going as far back as the early 90s, deemed by some to be considered Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, should give an idea as to why they have gotten some sort of clearance by Allied Western intelligence, when we know throughout the Obama administration they are able to continue funding and aiding Al-Qaeda, spawning ISIS further, still after 9/11, but in attempts to topple Syria and take down Bashar al-Assad. But this early 90s time frame with Darknazali, El-Hage, and Wadi in Cyprus and Germany is interesting, being that it's the same time frame Mohammed Atta has already moved there. Plus, according to a New York Times article March 12, 1993, it says that the two suspects involved in the World Trade Center bombing, Mohammed Salameh and Nadel Ayad, had a joint account with a German bank where they were receiving periodic wired money transfers ranging in the thousands.
But agents are looking for evidence of an international conspiracy. They're zeroing in on wire transfers of thousands of dollars from a German bank to Salameh and Ayad's joint checking account in New Jersey.
It has been speculated that they passed through Germany. That is by no means clear as to where their ultimate source is.
And being that Mahmoud Abu Halima was already beginning to be a fundamentalist when he lived in West Germany, if not already having gravitated to it before fleeing Egypt since he had just left before the Sadat assassination, contrary to the official narrative of Abu Halima being exclusively radicalized by the blind sheikh years later, does make it seem conceivable that there could have been a stronger command structure having come out of Germany, and with already the goal of targeting the Twin Towers, than what the establishment premise for it is, as Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, even on an influential level. Particularly as what's also pointed out in earlier books on Islamic terrorism, that Abu Halima repeatedly visited, even on frequent trips back to Germany after residing in New York, to both the Syrian Center in Aachen and Ikhwan Mosque in Munich, headed by an imam named Ahmad al-Khalifa at the time, who's also a member of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, where Abu Halima had sought spiritual counseling. And in addition to that, one more recent book called Mosque in Munich, Nazis, the CIA, and the Rise of Muslim Brotherhood in the West, by Ian Johnson 2010, also explains another link with the Sudanese Mamdouh Mahmoud Salim, who participated in the East Africa Embassy's bombings and was widely described as Al-Qaeda's founder and finance chief, plus bin Laden's personal mentor. He was arrested in 1998 in a small town near Munich while on a business trip to Germany. Before being extradited to the US, he called up Ahmed al-Khalifa and asked for spiritual guidance. He was later put on trial and sentenced to 32 years, which he is serving at Supermax ADX. Al-Khalifa confirmed to German authorities and press to have met both Abu Halima and Mamdouh. German intelligence was nevertheless alarmed and launched an all-out investigation into Mamdouh Salim's contacts. One in particular stood out, Mamoun Darknazali. However, his joint bank account with Darknazali was not investigated, according to the 2000 book, The Age of Sacred Terrorism, by Benjamin Daniel and Steve Simon. And don't simply pass these Syrian Muslim Brotherhood connections in the early 90s and in and around 9/11 as irrelevant or old news, because for those only triggered by what's only current and superficial, just last year in 2021, PBS covered a known Syrian Muslim Brotherhood member and leader for Syrian rebels, aka ISIS, in an extremely poor propaganda attempt trying to rebrand them as friendly, noble freedom fighters against the modernist secular Assad regime in an hour Frontline special simply titled The Jihadist. And as of right now, while this documentary film is being written, the US and part of the West is supporting the Zelensky regime in their conflict with Russia, added with the help of Syrian rebels, ISIS forces, in the Ukraine. But briefly continuing with Mamdouh Salim, the connections don't end there, as one might imagine with an East Africa bombing conspirator, that he would have either known or networked with Wadi El-Hage, and he certainly did in various companies of bin Laden as another secretary. But so did another founder, a Sudanese militant named Jamal al-Fadl, at least until he had a dispute with bin Laden and embezzled $110,000 from the organization, and defected by contacting the CIA via the U.S. Embassy in the northeastern African country of Eritrea, next to Sudan, and receiving encouragement from FBI agents Jack Clunan and Dan Coleman. Al-Fadl, after staying in Germany for a while, returned to the U.S. in spring 1996. Al-Fadl was taken on as a key prosecution witness in the early 2001 trial of the 4 accused in the U.S. Embassy's bombings, and also in the U.S. versus bin Laden absentia trial that began in February that same year. Benjamin Weiser wrote in a New York Times article February 21, 2001, ex-aide tells of plot to kill bin Laden that Mr. Al-Fadl said that before approaching the Americans in 1996, he went to Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, trying to raise money to start an opposition party to the National Islamic Front, the ruling party in Sudan. He said he also considered going to Israel to gain support, but did not. Interesting options Al-Fadl had before choosing Uncle Sam, wouldn't you say? But continuing back in the U.S. and with other guilty associates at Supermax prison.
Another terrorist in Supermax is Ramzi Yousef, the leader of the first World Trade Center attack in 1993.
What did you make of him?
The most interesting inmate in my career. I was surprised that he was extremely respectful, prayed almost on the hour.
Yousef has been living in ADX for 11 years, sacrificing to live by his own code.
Something as simple as recreating. He would have to be strip searched to go recreate. He chose not to do that because of his belief that it'd be inappropriate for us to show his body or see his body.
And so he stays in the cell?
Never been out, to my knowledge.
As strict as that seems, we're told that there is an even higher level of confinement, sort of an ultramax inside Supermax. It's a group of cells where there is virtually no human contact, not even with the guards, and there are only 2 prisoners who are considered so dangerous that they're locked in this place that's known as Range 13. One of them is World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Yousef. Warden Hood says Yousef is on Range 13 for just one reason.
He has a Charlie Manson look.
Charlie Manson look?
He just has the eyes. He has some charisma about him. He's in uniform, but you know that there's a powerful person that you're looking at.
You didn't want him in a place where he could give anybody any orders.
True.
We're told something strange is happening with Yousef. He now insists that he has renounced Islam and converted to Christianity. He's even begun leaving his cell for exercise. Warden Hood left before all this happened, but still, he doesn't buy it.
He's playing a game with someone. If he's doing that, he's doing it for the reaction. He's doing it for whatever. He is the real deal.
There have been some new developments at Supermax. There have been more hunger strikes and force feedings, and both Tommy Silverstein and Ramzi Yousef have been moved to new cells, which leaves Range 13 empty, at least for now.
And there have been quite a few other developments since that 60 Minutes piece in 2007. Yousef has also put out a hit on Zacarias Moussaoui, according to letters Moussaoui wrote requesting transfer to Gitmo because he had been assaulted and harassed by other inmates and guards, including Ramzi Yousef, who has threatened to kill him. But obviously everybody who has gotten close enough to Yousef that we've demonstrated so far seems to certify that he does not fit the fanatical Muslim persona, even if he has adapted to it soon after incarceration. He's consistently deceiving people, and he resonates as being a sociopath. But before we complete our assessment of Ramzi Yousef, going back to the February 26th bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, as already aforementioned with other groups taking claim for the Trade Center bombing, according to the Atlanta Constitution on the following day, February 27th, by foreign editor Randall Ashley. Take it with a grain of salt, the claim made 15 minutes before that blast, that is the work of Croatian militants. By some twist of logic, Croatians might think they have a motive, but so would every other group involved in the Balkan Wars. Sure enough, an hour after the blast, a person claiming to represent Serbian Liberation Front phoned police claiming responsibility and vowing further attacks if aid to Bosnia continues. And then the article continues. By Friday evening, 9 callers had claimed responsibility for the Trade Center explosion. Who knows if it is a coincidence that Croatian police defuse a bomb in a briefcase inside a plastic bag outside the U.S. Embassy in Zagreb on Friday. And apparently that was the case, as it also turns out that the Trade Center wasn't the only U.S. target that day, as police did defuse a bomb hidden in a small briefcase outside the embassy in central Zagreb, Croatia, and sealed off the street for 3 hours while defusing it. Police declined to comment. But going back to other groups taking credit, in the 1994 book, 2 Seconds Under the World, Terror Comes to America, the conspiracy behind the World Trade Center bombing, written by 4 Newsday journalists, it says, by the time Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly walked into the 10 a.m. session the following morning, February 27, 1993, 27 callers had claimed to know something about the blast. After the 1:35 p.m. call to the 1st Precinct, others didn't start flooding 911 until after 4 p.m. By midnight, Colombian drug cartels had the most votes. 3 calls claimed the drug lords were responsible. The Black Liberation Front, Chinese militants, and Arab terrorists each had 1 call. So did the New World Revolution, whatever that was. The rest of the calls were too disjointed to be understood. But shortly after midnight, Serbians took credit again. At 1:29 a.m., Iraq weighed in, followed by another vote for Yugoslavia at 2:31, and Iraq again 12 minutes later. More disjointed, rambling accusations came throughout the morning. A freewheeling speculation session began, and a litany of possible motives were tossed around. Could it really be over Yugoslavia? Someone asked. President Clinton had just announced that the United States was airlifting food and supplies to Bosnia. The timing made the motive plausible.
Across the river in New Jersey, a terminal at Newark International Airport was evacuated today following a bomb threat. No device was found and the building is open again tonight. But hourly parking's been banned beneath all of that airport's terminals because President Clinton is scheduled to land in Newark on Monday for a speech at Rutgers University. And in Washington, D.C. tonight, security's been beefed up at the White House, the Capitol building, and other national monuments. Bomb-sniffing dogs and mirrors are being used to check cars for possible explosive devices following the World Trade blast. Officials say there have been no threats, that these measures are simply precautionary.
A group of tourists in Egypt got no warning before a bomb exploded last night. It happened in Cairo. A crude bomb packed with steel nails went off in a crowded coffee shop. 4 people were killed, including 2 tourists. 18 were injured. Police suspect a Muslim extremist group that has been targeting tourists in recent months. But late today, the group issued a statement denying any involvement in the bombing.
Besides what would seem to be an anomaly from the events with the IRA bombing in London, that same following day after the Trade Center bombing, that a bomb went off in an Egyptian cafe killing tourists, which was suspected of being carried out by followers of Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Blind Sheikh. Also in that same day within the context of the bomb threat at Newark Airport.
But in the Philippines tonight, at least 25 people have been injured in an explosion at the Zamboanga Airport. Officials in that southern city say a bomb went off in the terminal building, causing extensive damage, and that another explosive device was found and safely detonated. 4 of those injured are reportedly in critical condition tonight. No group has claimed responsibility, but police are speculating that blast was the work of Muslim extremists.
And interestingly enough, despite those incidents on the same day or afterward are not categorically implicated in the same system or pattern of global terrorism, this incident should be very foretelling as to what Yousef and family connections already had in the Philippines, separate from the official narrative suggesting that such networking took place a year later. We can't simply ignore the Philippines, especially when a whistleblower, like former National Security Advisor to the Bush administration, Richard Clarke, as what he said in regards to the unlikely coincidence of Terry Nichols being in the Philippines the same time Ramzi Yousef was.
We know that Terry Nichols and Ramzi Yousef, both people were in the same city at the same time. That's odd. Both people were interested in making bombs. Both people oppose the American government. Is it conceivable that in a mid-sized Philippine city, the two people who were interested in making bombs and hated the American government could have found each other somehow? I think it's conceivable.
What we've seen so far tells us the major significance ADX Supermax has over Gitmo. But how unsettling does this coincidence sound when Terry Nichols is incarcerated along with Yousef at ADX? Unsettling enough that even former California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher actually went to meet Nichols and held a press conference about his obstructions to interview Ramzi Yousef.
I have been denied for a year and a half now the right to speak to a federal prisoner, namely Ramzi Yousef. He's one of the top terrorists of the world, and he's been in prison for 10 years. He was responsible for the first World Trade Center bombing and is deeply, deeply involved with the creation of Al-Qaeda. What's more important to me at this moment is that Ramzi Yousef may have had a connection to the Oklahoma City bombing, and if that's true, the American people need to know about that. And there are other questions that need to be posed to Ramzi Yousef. He's a federal prisoner, and the United States Congress, especially those of us in investigative subcommittees, have a right to question federal prisoners. This is not someone who was just arrested yesterday, where there's some ongoing investigation that deals with this person. He's been in jail for 10 years. What we have is a denial of the right of Congress in order to set a precedent that we do not have the right to interview federal prisoners. The official reason that I have been denied the right to speak to Ramzi Yousef is that there is a, quote, ongoing investigation. And of course, I have been told by many people who work for the Justice Department and the White House that that is a standard phrase that is used to dismiss congressional inquiries without any substance to the dismissal, meaning this is made up. The person who said that it is an ongoing investigation to me simply said that as a phrase to dismiss a member of Congress and to dismiss Congress's right to participate in a particular activity, like interviewing this particular federal prisoner.
But aside the 8.5-year interval between 9/11 and the 1993 Trade Center bombing, with Oklahoma City bombing being right in the middle, it's a shame that these three unresolved and sensitive events, which have become major social impacts on everyday life, seem overwhelmingly connected and in unusual, contrary circumstances, are not seriously being dealt by a realistic activist movement or archetypal organization pursuing real truth and accountability for who or what is ultimately at fault, even if becoming disillusioned by discovering vulnerabilities and weaknesses within the establishment that have played a role in judicial obstructions and cover-ups. But there is much documentation regarded as circumstantial evidence about Terry Nichols, already married to a Philippine mail-order wife, Marif, that he, by himself, frequented the Philippines at the same time Ramzi Yousef and company were present, and that it could link to the Oklahoma City bombing as Al-Qaeda and on to 9/11, and subsequently after the Trade Center bombing. According to Oklahoma author Mitchell Gray, who was intimately called upon as an Arabic-speaking immigration attorney for Zacarias Moussawi's roommate, Hussein Al-Attas, who had also been incarcerated for INS violations just before 9/11, an account that is the basis of his first book, I Heard You Were Going on Jihad, How a Minnesota FBI Agent May Have Prevented a Second Wave of Attacks Before 9/11 and Exposed the Oklahoma Terror Network, on pages 79 and 80, indicates that Gray had been in contact with Congressman Dana Rohrabacher's staff, which provided him a report about a link between Terry Nichols and Ramzi Yousef through phone records that revealed during his 5 months living in the United States, he placed 3 phone calls to a residence of a Filipina in Queens, New York named Myla Densing, with one call lasting approximately 30 minutes. At the time of the phone calls, Densing was living in the same row house apartment building as Adoro and Ernesto Malalan, close friends and neighbors who were also from Cebu City. Ernst Malalan is the cousin of Marif Nichols and owned the boarding house in Cebu City where Terry and Marif lived during their last trip to the Philippines. And there are still unanswered questions regarding Ramzi Yousef and his extended families, past and present, that we don't have enough time to cover their whereabouts, even though we've covered quite a bit of controversial links from him and his family of greater infamy. But separate from the many unanswered questions around Timothy McVeigh and the OKC bombing, a scenario of Ramzi Yousef and Terry Nichols crossing paths and networking is highly highly unlikely to most Americans. But when considering the 2 years of terrorist activities Yousef carried out as a fugitive after the '93 bombing throughout the Philippines, Thailand, Iran, and Pakistan, as with being contracted to assassinate Benazir Bhutto in 1994, only 2 assassinations have been attributed to the so-called Al-Qaeda organization. Ahmed Shah Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan 2 days before 9/11, and then tragically with Benazir Bhutto in 2007. Not even Nosair killing Meir Kahane is counted. So if you still think Yousef's terrorist aspirations are exclusive to the Islamic mindset, when considering the crossed path with Terry Nichols, viewers can also read up on what Peter Lance also uncovered in 2013 with a sting set up on Yousef after his arrest while incarcerated in New York by the feds along with inmate and son of infamous mafia hitman for the Colombo crime family, Gregory Scarpa Jr., that was carried out by him as an informant jailed with Yousef in 1996. From that revelation with the discussions carried out between the two, you might want to envision Yousef having been a contract terrorist instead. And besides for 1995 being framed as a white militia conspiracy, Oklahoma in the Midwest with Texas is a central hub noted for Middle Eastern terrorists ahead of 9/11, as a couple of hijackers stayed in Oklahoma City before momentarily. Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and Nawaf al-Hazmi, plus Zacharias Moussaoui had actually lived there, attending flight school in Norman, Oklahoma. But the presence there in Oklahoma is still prevalent in the past by the same apparatus before, in the late 80s, with Wadi El-Hage, who was living in Texas at the time, met up with Mahmoud Abu Halima at an Islamic conference in Oklahoma, where it is said that Abu Halima told El-Hage to buy a .38 caliber revolver for him and that it was the same one that Nosair used to kill Kahane. And Oklahoma seems to be more like a crossroads or central point, because also take notice of who resides in Texas. Like Yousef's close friend Abdel Hakim Marad, not only did he receive pilot training more than any 9/11 hijacker, he had also trained in San Antonio and is completely in the middle of the Bojinka plot, where then, after the Oklahoma City bombing, he admitted verbally on April 19, 1995, and in writing, that Ramzi Yousef's Liberation Army was responsible for the OKC bombing. Liberation Army is the same title Nadal Al-Ayad had left as a phone-recorded message taking blame for the Trade Center bombing. And then there's Hussein al-Hussein, the supposed Iraqi that's the focus in Jana Davis's book, The Third Terrorist. Despite her marginalizing other competing theories about the Oklahoma City bombing, her pursuit on al-Hussein and all those linked was just. And even if her findings and conclusions are embraced by neocon opportunists and their attempts for Iraq war pretext, the consequences or legal actions taken against Davis in writing her book by the power of al-Hussein's legal team should be questioned, especially when it was later revealed that al-Hussein was working at Boston Logan Airport, where hijacked flights 11 and 175, both planes that hit the World Trade Center, departed from during the period of the September 11th attacks, and was even questioned by authorities after. But even after the Oklahoma City bombing, and before moving to the Boston area, Hussein al-Hussein also moved to Irving, Texas, where he had been arrested for a DUI there. Aside for the glaring coincidence of Ryder moving vehicles, isn't it interesting how Imad Salem detailed how the bomb making for the Landmark plot and the bomb used in Oklahoma City 1995 were similar, being ammonium nitrate fertilizer bombs as used in the World Trade Center? But isn't it also interesting when between that time frame, in 1994, while no kind of terrorist attack occurred in the US, the same type of ammonium nitrate bomb was used at the AMIA, that's the Argentine Israelite Mutual Association building in Buenos Aires. The incident was carried out by a suicide bomber in a van, in which killed 85 people and injured over 300. Yet, how come Iran and Hezbollah were first blamed for the AMIA bombing? A better question, why is Hezbollah constantly and falsely accused for other terrorist attacks elsewhere? Why is it said that Hezbollah was founded with the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon under the planning of Imad Mughniya, which Hezbollah has denied, and a group called Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility? And what does it say when it was also revealed by Viktor Ostrovsky, by way of deception, the making and unmaking of a Mossad officer being met with pressure not to be released, in which it details the Mossad's foreknowledge of the Marine barracks bombing, but did not alert US officials, where 241 military service personnel ended up being killed. In fact, why do most Americans not recognize the Marine barracks bombing as the largest terrorist attack on Americans before 9/11? Separate from other embassy attacks or incidents carried out on US soil, is there a common social disconnect amongst the American consensus that sees military servicemen and women less innocent or unequivocal as victims of terrorism compared to civilian or traveling casualties? Could that also be why such events like the attack on the USS Liberty aren't well received to the public, just as the Pentagon attack with Flight 77 on September 11th isn't well received by conspiracy theorists and 9/11 truthers. And in continuing with attacks on U.S. soldiers overseas, why did the U.S. government accuse the pro-Hezbollah militant Shia organization in Saudi Arabia, Hezbollah Al-Hage, and Iran for the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, when according to the Saudi government, the bombing was carried out by Saudi Islamic militants, including many veterans of the Afghan War, thus Al-Qaeda? Why did Ali Mohammed in 1984, after offering his services to the CIA in Cairo, was he also stationed in Hamburg and assigned to infiltrate mosques associated to Hezbollah? Why a month after 9/11 did the Bush administration offer a $5 million reward leading to the arrest of Hezbollah members in the 1985 hijackings of TWA 847, especially when one of them was already in U.S. custody since 1987, captured member Fawaz Yunus? But yet, 7 years later after 9/11, one of the main hijackers and leaders, Hezbollah founder Imad Mughniyeh, who was also able to hide for decades after, even gone under plastic surgery to change his identity, ends up getting assassinated in Syria by the Mossad in 2008 with the help of their infiltrating spy, Ali Jarrar, 9/11 hijacker Zaid Jarrar's cousin. And looking back at these two Lebanese, Jarrar and El-Hage, having both stayed in Germany, the US, and elsewhere, is part of the Mossad's playbook specifically using Lebanese assets so that it's easier to set them up as a pretext to frame Hezbollah? And with Palestinians, we've covered a great deal about El-Hage, and there's still more to find out. But as even PBS Frontline themselves highlighted, that without El-Hage and the items that he carried when arriving at JFK Airport with Ramzi Yousef in 1992, there would be no premise to label such a loose network as Al-Qaeda, as demonstrated on their special about the late head of the FBI Terrorism Task Force, John O'Neill. But why in the late 80s, after El-Hage's release from an Israeli prison and turned into Mossad asset, was he assigned to Al-Fatah, a group known to receive weapons, explosives, and training from the Soviet Union, but then somehow unnoticeably he was able to join Hamas, who was fighting with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets? And like Iyad Ishmael living in Dallas, who suddenly appears after the 93 bombing conspiracy, El-Hage had also previously lived in Texas working as a pizza deliverer in San Antonio before entering the US again in 1992. Essentially, El-Hage could be considered the bombing mastermind of 1993, being that he was also in a prime position while detained to make orders, since Yousef wasn't able to entirely set up the bomb without El-Hage's manuals and experience. And from the bombing attempts that we have charted from Yousef, most of them were unsuccessful. El-Hage has since been transferred from Supermax to Terre Haute prison in Indiana 2018, and he, like many of these conspirators, are serving life sentences and are unapproachable for questions and interviews, which again tells you many answers could be found on US shores rather than further obstructions through Gitmo, Cuba. But lastly and luckily, that's not the situation when it comes to the Pakistani Wali Khan Amin Shah as far as getting some sort of answers, as he's also in Terre Haute and was right in the middle of the Bojinka planning, for which also Ramzi Yousef continued organizing under the Liberation Army 5th Battalion title, according to what was contained within a laptop and plot. Since Wali Khan Shah has been cooperative with US authorities, he was set to be free already in March of 2022, but there has been no media coverage about it. Perhaps we may get answers to who else was behind these 90s terrorist attacks and 9/11 and how they really functioned. But if these so-called top Al-Qaeda masterminds and leaders aren't born and raised fundamentalist Muslims, just like the case with Osama bin Laden, ironically, who in his early college years liked to live it up as a partying bachelor, shouldn't this all in the long run be called Arab terrorism? And coming back to 1993 with Ramzi and Mohammed Salameh, who get in the car wreck on January 24, 1993, although no clear explanation as to why Salameh was driving so nervously, resulting in the collision, neither is any explanation given as to what Yousef and Salameh were actually out doing, because it just so happens to be that the following day was the CIA headquarters shooting.
It was the height of the morning rush hour. The traffic light at the entrance to the CIA on Route 123 had turned red. Cars came to a stop. From the center lane, a man emerged from his car carrying a high-powered rifle. He calmly walked between the two left lanes where motorists were waiting for the left turn signal into the CIA compound. Starting with the lead car, he opened fire at point-blank range. Then he turned, firing at the car on his other side and on down the line of standing vehicles. In the far left lane, the badly wounded driver of one car managed to turn into the visitor center at the CIA main gate, where he alerted guards. A female passenger in this Volkswagen jumped from her car and ran to the CIA, also alerting guards. Dr. Barrett Burka and his wife were passing by when they heard the shots.
My wife suddenly screamed, "There's a man shooting." And I looked to my immediate left, and about 10, 15 feet away, there was a fellow with what appeared to be a high-powered hunting rifle shooting into the automobiles.
The gunman's final toll, 2 men killed, 3 others wounded. The CIA identified the dead as 28-year-old Frank Darling of Reston, Virginia, and 66-year-old Lansing Bennett, also of Reston. Both were employed by the CIA. 2 of the wounded were also on the CIA staff, and a third worked for a CIA contractor. In the shock and confusion of the moment, police believe the gunman walked back into his light brown compact station wagon and drove off, eluding police despite extensive searches by air and ground.
A Pakistani national, Mir Amil Khanzi, killed the 2 CIA employees in their cars as they were waiting at a stoplight and wounded 3 others outside of the George Bush Center for Intelligence, CIA headquarters campus, Langley, Virginia. Khanzi fled the country and was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, sparking an international manhunt. He was captured by Joint FBI-CIA Inter-Services Intelligence Task Force in Pakistan in 1997 and arraigned to the United States to stand trial. He admitted shooting the victims, was found guilty of capital and first-degree murder, and was executed by lethal injection in 2002. Ironically, as what's pointed out in History Channel's Road to 9/11 documentary, the intelligence task force in Pakistan were more concerted in their efforts to capture Khanzi for the CIA headquarters shooting rather than trailing Ramzi Yousef for the Trade Center bombing, as the task force were only motivated by being tipped off by Yousef's whereabouts through his confidant Ishtak Parker, wanting the $2 million FBI reward, while simultaneously as the task force were on the manhunt about to almost capture Khanzi, which would have rendered them to have been able to capture him sooner in 1995 rather than 2 years later in 1997. And coming back to Uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, isn't it also interesting, as reported by Terry McDermott on June 24, 2002 in the LA Times, while KSM was still wanted, the members of his cell, including a girlfriend, had a drinking party to celebrate the anniversary of the 1988 Pan Am Flight 103 explosion over Lockerbie, Scotland, an incident officially blamed on Gaddafi and Libyan pilots, and not anything remotely to do with Al-Qaeda. Throughout this film, we've covered a lengthy time span in the 1990s, and it's vital to helping understand what the problems really are and what ones will continue to lay ahead. And separate from the focus of physical cover-ups the truth movement seems only obsessed with, these crimes are still connected, even as a pre-existing systemic problem, and it shows that there is a real branch-out effect of operatives between 9/11 and 1993. That's why it's important to understand not just graphic anomalies and the atrocities of terrorist incidents committed or the pretext potentials attempted, but mainly the historical efforts of prevention by anti-terrorism task force, even if such conclusions and focus seems to emphasize the bottom end of a greater conspiracy. Most 9/11 truthers are oblivious to official narratives of these crimes, just as much as they are not realizing they've been indoctrinated in a cult conspiracy worldview, and some will even deny or doubt its popularity subjectively. And in that subversive mind frame, within what remains as a 9/11 truth movement, has been emotionally attached to, combined with still being ignorant on past and present Middle Eastern affairs, real foreign policy. They are afraid of falling under a spell of pro-war propaganda, along with being disillusioned by their fantastical expectations that they've been long misled into believing are the ulterior conspirators behind 9/11, and not bothering to investigate the validity of Al-Qaeda or Islamic terrorism as a tangent shift or trend throughout the Arab and Third World. A prime example ignored, ending the 90s era, is the Millennium Plot, as in one almost occurred during the 2000 New Year's Y2K celebration, not just up into the Canadian border with Ahmed Rassam and those linked to him in New York City and elsewhere, including later revealed in 2016 that the Saudi imam and consular to the Saudi consulate, Fahad al-Thamari, known as an intermediate in the infamous 20 Pages link, also had telephone contacts in Los Angeles of individuals suspected of helping Ahmed Rassam, as future 9/11 hijackers Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi are entering the country at LAX, later settling in San Diego. But even the other Millennium incidents are ignored and did actually take place in South Asia and the Middle East then, and since 9/11, into further escalations 4 administrations later, continuing the unending mess with the War on Terror. With the complexity of the crimes and criminals before and during 9/11, a lot of basic questions are not being asked. Such as in the early 90s, why did Osama bin Laden choose to move to Sudan in 1992 rather than return back to Afghanistan? Who is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar? And why did he become one of the first suspects for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing? Why isn't the hijacking of Air France Flight 8969 over the Christmas holiday in 1994 by the Algerian armed Islamic group not found to be linked or included to Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network, nor particularly considered to have been in concert with the planned Bojinka plot discovered 2 weeks earlier in the Philippines when the events were nearly for the same time frame, plus that the Air France 8969 hijackers' target was to crash into the Eiffel Tower? Why isn't there any effort to capture Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was alive and then dead in 2020, only to reappear alive again the following year in a 60-minute video on the 20-year anniversary of September 11th, which even after the US has pulled out of Afghanistan with the Taliban takeover of the government, al-Zawahiri still roamed free somewhere in that region, only to finally be killed a couple of months ago in July of 2022. And what about the 1980s? Was there earlier warning signs of attacking the World Trade Center back then? What was the US's approach on dealing with international terrorism? Was there ever a call for a war on terrorism then, such as the failed war on drugs? How about Europe back then? Where did Islamic terrorism exist? Was there another underground network like Al-Qaeda that predates it? Why did the 1986 West Berlin discotheque bombing happen? Was Libya really responsible?
Look for it, Marty! Who do you think? The Libyans!
Isn't there something to be said about how just within less than 15 years, the US went from Muammar Gaddafi as Arab villain, then on to Saddam Hussein as Arab villain, and then Osama bin Laden, but then back to Saddam, and then back to Gaddafi? Especially when Libya issued the first arrest warrant through Interpol against bin Laden on March 16, 1998, naming him the main suspect in the murder of 2 German citizens in Libya in 1994. This is all before the US issued their bin Laden arrest warrant months later for a conspiracy to attack defense utilities of the United States. How was ISIS able to manifest in Libya a decade after 9/11, while there has been an ongoing coalition with the war on terrorism? Who was Abu al-Zarqawi, often now thought to be the father of ISIS? And how did he just all of a sudden appear in Iraq, ultimately becoming another pretext for the 2003 US invasion? And why did he also behead Nick Berg? And what about the 70s? Who the hell is Carlos de Jackal? What was the Black September? What ultimately was the consequence of Munich in 1972? Why does this kind of activity go back to Germany so much? These historical questions, not only pertaining to the pre- and post-bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, do have somewhat useful information, but they have not been thoroughly challenged within mainstream alternative conspiracy theories or within the established 9/11 truth movements when scrutinized over its popular inside job claims. In sequential contrast to 9/11 itself, when these attacks were certainly carried out on the surface definitively by a loose association of Arabs and or individuals who identify as Muslims within a conventional Al-Qaeda nexus. And even if given positions of deniability by feds, doesn't make it a default reason to grant collusion accusations or suggest government conspiracies and or domestic complicity, but instead can also be more to do with neglect and compartment conflicts, as well as covering up their own mistakes. But none of those obstructions, given along with real anomalies still showing cover-ups, detracts that these crimes were not carried out by an ulterior international conspiracy. In other words, what Alex Jones has proclaimed for decades, misguided by those discredited sources that even predate him, and that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was an inside job, or in his brand of a false flag, is utter nonsense. Regardless of patriotic rhetoric and local sentiment, retroactively when looking back at younger Alex Jones given his Christian compromise and disposition of being a college dropout, to him, in what seemed a sincere proclamation at the time to implicate a shadow government in what also occurred 2 years later after 1993 with the Oklahoma City bombing, in contrast to the overview of what we have uncovered with 1993, Alex Jones is not interested in correcting any of these false narratives he has promoted for nearly 2 decades, even when it comes to the most controversial implication involvements of all, the celebratory incident of the high-fiving dancing Israelis of 9/11, which is a widely accepted claim now by what's left of the 9/11 truth movement, while Jones continues to marginalize and outright omit it.
I've got so many questions, but you are vindicated. This has got to be the 50th time the last 6 months on the radical Muslims celebrating, not just in New Jersey, but New York.
Diluting 9/11 truth further than what it is already, damaged from its inception as a founder, ascribing to and promoting the hoax claim that a missile hit the Pentagon by way of loose change and non-credentialed skeptics, the kind of sloppy research that's gotten him in the mess he's in now with the Sandy Hook lawsuits against him.
And that is how I know you lied to me when you said you didn't have text messages about Sandy Hook.
That's why, in regarding his vicinity in 1995, Jones's conclusions from his first-hand research and publications on OKC should be equally re-examined and scrutinized, just as they should for 9/11, since he's clearly gotten it wrong from the beginning with 1993. And it's prevalent now with the legal troubles he's gotten himself into, becoming more than just a loss of credibility and his own finances with these lawsuits against him over the Sandy Hook hoax he instigated. But what's also in jeopardy is his own mechanism to continue to perpetuate modern urban myths as a means to keep his operation afloat, with Sandy Hook being the catalyst of getting himself deplatformed on all the major social and multimedia sites, or banned by what we now know as Big Tech. Aside acknowledging Jones's failures, lies, and omissions regarding the 1993 and OKC bombing, the bottom line is that despite all the evidence of Israeli intelligence foreknowledge and involvement in 9/11, we know for certain that the trauma, grief, and devastation of September 11th did not faze Alex Jones one bit into disavowing Zionism and becoming an ardent non-interventionist, truly conscious of disastrous U.S. foreign policy past, current, and future, or even genuinely motivated to bring about national restoration. Plus, after transitioning throughout Obama's second term, followed up by his service for Trump's one and only term in office, we don't need to go through all of Alex Jones to figure out who and what he ultimately stands for, and that's pretty much just himself. It should be obvious by now since the January 6th Capitol storm incident, since in retrospect 2 decades earlier, as pointed out by pioneering predecessor conspiracy con artist William Cooper, who practically Jones is a protege of, now does have credibility or another foreboding prediction under his belt, since Cooper exposed Jones's infamous New Year's Eve Y2K 2000 publicity stunt and apocalyptic hysteria, in that Jones is a liability in the Patriot movement and talk radio, and a dupe that could be used to immobilize martial law or a police state.
He spent 45 minutes of the first hour preparing his radio audience to believe that Russia was going to nuke us because of Y2K. Yeah, this was a setup from the word go. This guy is not on our side. See, I don't know if he's a government agent or not, but if he's not a government agent, he was sure duped on December the 31st. I bet you most of the people who were listening on December 31st don't even have the brains to be able to put all this together and understand that they were set up to be terrorized, to become hysterical, to head for the hills, to do something stupid, and I'm awful glad that that didn't happen.
Cooper may have been wrong about the Trade Center bombing and many other things, but he wasn't wrong about Jones. It's clear by now that Alex Jones has been some sort of military intelligence or special interest asset, not working towards the common good to unite Americans and the people, at least when it mattered throughout the decade after September 11th. Instead, his program has become deeply immersed, if not leading the current culture war climate, aside that it is already discredited with its absurd style of conspiracy theories. But his influence is self-evident, and it shows just by his choice of social priorities, when even during a more recent anniversary of September 11th in 2020, a 9/11 every other day, total daily abortions near death toll on September 11th. Where have we heard that before? Can you say Judeo-Christian cult? But that was the theme of the Alex Jones Show on the 19-year anniversary of 9/11, where he declared abortion as America's greatest sin, where Jones has all of a sudden conveniently forgotten that America's real sin has been its military-industrial complex and dastardly foreign policy and interventionism, particularly towards third world countries, that provoked 9/11 in the first place. Regardless of foreign or domestic intelligence ties and provocations, as its greater sin was covering up and using the deaths of nearly 3,000 people killed in broad daylight to only sustain the problem that got us here in the first place, and will only happen again, which already makes the future look bleak and no safer or closer to any resolve than we were before. That's why the only way to try to bring some clarity about 9/11, riddled with unanswered questions and a variety of accusations and competing theories, is to really bring about clarity in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. This is why, since having come into public spotlight, analyzing Imad Salem appearances are so valid regarding all the confusion there's been about the events of 1993, even unfortunate where 2 of his interviews are on the platform where most of the confusion stems from, The Alex Jones Show. And getting a clearer understanding of Salem's story is not brought upon appearing on Infowars, as one might expect, but Salem's interviews reveal more about Jones himself rather than Salem, when considering the timing and manner that Jones has attempted to marginalize and re-envision both attacks on the Twin Towers, since Jones's 9/11 truth theories, for which the most part was cultivated in his Infowars corral, and now with Salem all in happenstance before the one and only appearance of Donald Trump, should raise some flags or at least be put into consideration. But then again, so are a lot of other general themes and claims around 9/11 truth, not necessarily at fault or exclusive to the Infowars network, but still, between Boomers and Generation X, U.S. administrations previous to September 11th have been prematurely analyzed and lack real nuance in understanding foreign policy or even conspiracy theories in retrospect, particularly for anyone who just grew up in the 80s. So there's also that to consider as a truth movement, especially if you developed a sort of set beliefs or expectations as to ultimate 9/11 conspirators and worldviews that have all been part of or welcomed to the Infowars corral. Because in all seriousness, regardless of administrations, governments past, present, or the legacy media, what we've demonstrated about 1993 should be thoroughly digested by those who identify as truthers or whatever is left over claiming itself to be a 9/11 truth movement, in order to build a reasonable and potential legal case in the pursuit of 9/11 justice, by also helping bring reasonable public expectations on uncovering who and what is thoroughly responsible for all these inseparable terrorist attacks and crimes, in contrast to what the authorities have narrowed down to the public as masterminds. The bottom line is that whoever has been organizing these events are willingly doing so to set up a false pretext to implicate Iraq, and that this motive spans many years before even the slightest suggestion of think tank planning with the neoconservative Project for a New American Century. And as with September 11th, there are still popular misconceptions believed within 9/11 truth that misleads to dead ends. For the sake of entertaining a Zionist conspiracy or conspirators, or dare I say, for those in the belief that the 9/11 attacks were all part of some big Jewish plan. For your information, the Odin Yanan plan for Greater Israel was already published in 1982. And furthermore, most that only pursued those limited angles failed to realize that such ambitions wouldn't be exclusive to a conservative Republican or right-wing administration to fulfill its goals, or dare I say, prophecy. And this has been one of many great flaws about 9/11 truth. When subjectively looking at President George W. Bush, that being a narrative that the Bush dynasty are truly Zionists. This couldn't be further from the truth. If you either lived or researched the 80s regarding foreign and domestic policy and scandals, even outside the Iran-Contra affair, or more recently, in the past 2 decades, at the beginning of the millennium with the presidential election that should have been telling, in that ideally, a very possible alternate reality for 2001 could have happened, and a Project for a New American Century administration wouldn't have been necessarily nested or in office in order for the September 11th attacks and cover-ups to succeed, and consequential Iraq war quagmires, even if sheer fantasy was entertained with an administration participating in the attacks.
Naming a Jewish man to a presidential ticket is groundbreaking. There are 6 million Jews in America, 2% of the population. So how will it play with the American voters?
In the Jewish community today, great pride. One rabbi calls Lieberman's breakthrough the political equivalent of a Jew landing on the moon. But there is concern, too, about an anti-Jewish backlash, and that Jews will be blamed if Gore loses.
My very initial reaction was that Vice President Gore unfortunately did himself in. The majority of the country is not ready to accept a Jewish vice president.
Lieberman's religion does affect him as a candidate.
Without addressing the election scandal that year, and rather than what commonly held beliefs exist about Dick Cheney's role as vice president in the post-9/11 era, it should be pointed out that he was only a signatory member of PNAC, and mainly that it's worth envisioning that his seat would have been likely filled with Joe Lieberman under an Al Gore administration during the September 11th attacks, especially with 9/11 truth's expectation in pyramid structures pulling the strings of which president gets selected rather than elected. In consideration of the most sensational ideal September 11th American Zionist or shadow government conspiracy, it's one thing that should also be remembered that 8 years later, after Joe Lieberman left the Democratic Party, becoming independent, he became a loud and open supporter for John McCain. You know, Mr. Anthrax likely came from Iraq, appearing on David Letterman in October 2001, and appearing in 2012 in Syria, having meetings and making deals with ISIS, and the list goes on. Now think about that in addition to possibilities for a moment for the perfect shadow government conspiracy, when also considering that McCain was close to defeating W. Bush in the Republican run for the 2000 election.
Well, it's kind of politics, and John and I shook hands,
And we said we were going to run ads, and I kind of smiled my way through the early primaries and got defined. I'm not going to let it happen again. And we shook hands, and unfortunately, he ran an ad that equated me to Bill Clinton. He questioned my trustworthiness.
Are you saying he broke the agreement with you?
I'm just saying, you can disagree on issues. We'll debate issues. But whatever you do, don't equate my integrity and trustworthiness to Bill Clinton. That's about as low a blow as you can give in the Republican primary.
And that's what...
Another reason why a Bush administration conspiracy behind 9/11 isn't actually possible, or even dealing with reality, as I have briefly pointed out in other previous film work, is that it was known soon after September 11th and in later publications that the Secret Service had gained intel that Air Force One was a target on 9/11. No information was ever provided on exactly how, but the threat was taken seriously and was one of the reasons for sudden evasive changes in his flight travel on Air Force One and returning back to Washington, D.C. And it is true, which was also made an example in ridicule to the Bush administration after September 11th, on how much intel they had which should have foresaw and prevented the attacks from happening, since earlier that year in June, during the 27th G8 summit in Genoa, Italy, in which prominent world leaders, including Bush, had attended, and that they were also warned by Italian authorities that Islamic terrorists led by Osama bin Laden might try to assassinate President Bush with crashing a hijacked airliner, to which further added extra security measures put in place to prevent such an attack, like surface-to-air missiles. And not only that, but where W. Bush stayed the night before 9/11 on September 10th at the Colony Beach and Tennis Resort on Longboat Key, Florida, had also surface-to-air missiles on the roof as added protection as an irregular measure. But despite the known threat to Air Force One on 9/11, and having surface-to-air missiles on the roof of where Bush was staying at in Longboat Key Resort, was not a guaranteed assurance that the president was safe from an attack. Because according to the local Longboat Observer, on September 26, 2001, had reported that hours before Bush made his famous appearance at the Sarasota school reading My Pet Goat to a classroom full of elementary kids, that around 6 a.m. before the president's early morning jog, a van occupied by men of Middle Eastern descent had pulled up to the colony stating they had a poolside interview with the president. Carol Mooneyhan, Longboat Key Fire Marshal, said, the self-proclaimed reporters then asked for a Secret Service agent by name. Guards from security relayed the request to the receptionist, who had not heard of either the agent or plans for an interview, Mooneyhan said. The article also states, the agent told the occupants of the van to contact the president's public relations office in Washington, D.C., and turned them away from the premise, Mooneyhan said. In light of the attacks, Mooneyhan wonders if what he witnessed is related to the events of September 11th. So does the FBI. That's very strange, said an unnamed agent with the Sarasota field office of the FBI, who directed agents to look into the matter. Earlier, the FBI questioned a Longboat Key man who also had a strange run-in with a van occupied by men of Middle Eastern descent. At 8:50 a.m., the man stood on the Sarasota Bayfront waiting to watch the presidential motorcade pass. A dilapidated van passed him with two men of Middle Eastern descent screaming out the windows, down with Bush, and raising their fists in the air. It should also be pointed out that 2 days before this in Afghanistan, U.S. ally Ahmed Shah Massoud, Afghan politician and military commander of the Northern Alliance, was killed by two Middle Eastern suicide assassins from Europe, posing as press, using camera equipment that was converted into an improvised explosive. But in retrospect, considering the Bush dynasty and the previous assassination threat on the father, former President George H.W. Bush in Kuwait, as already aforementioned, there was another assassination attempt on his life that is much less known, for obvious reasons. In the former Mossad officer Viktor Ostrovsky's book, The Other Side of Deception, details that in the fall of 1991, he had told a group of Canadian parliamentarians that he had received secret intelligence suggesting that the Mossad's hatred of Bush and support for Vice President Dan Quayle might lead to an attempt on the president's life. Israel considered Quayle, Mr. Potato, much closer to Israel than Bush. Bush had particularly angered Israel by attempting to pressure Israel into ending its illegal settlement expansion on confiscated Palestinian land by withholding loan guarantees until Israel ended this practice.
It was the darkest cloud between Israel and America in decades, said one official in Jerusalem. The angriest exchange since Eisenhower told the Israelis to get out of Suez in 1956. Tempers were flaring at today's cabinet meeting. One right-wing minister was asked whether he thinks President Bush is an anti-Semite.
He's very close to it.
To what?
To being anti-Semite and anti-Israel.
But even cabinet members close to Shamir said they saw no reason to back down on Israel's request for the loan guarantees, even though President Bush says he'll veto the measure if it gets through Congress.
Israel has nothing to change in its policy. We want the loan guarantees and we hope to get them as soon as possible. And the rest remains at the discretion of the President and the Congress in America.
What's really at issue is this: Israel's settlement drive in the occupied territories. President Bush wants it stopped. Calls settlements the biggest obstacles on the path to a peace conference. But since Shamir won't freeze the settlements, the president throws the money. Israelis believe it's as simple as that.
Ostrowski's information was then relayed to Paul Pete McCloskey, former Republican congressman from California, who had recently been appointed by Bush to the National and Community Service Commission, who had traveled to Ottawa to debrief Ostrowski. Ostrowski told McCloskey that the Mossad wanted to do everything possible to preserve a state of war between Israel and its neighbors, assassinating President Bush if necessary. Ostrowski wrote that an extremist faction within the Mossad was responsible for the plan. He said they kept the plan secret from then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, though they believed that Shamir would have ordered such a hit himself if he hadn't been constrained by politics. The plan was to be carried out at the 1991 Madrid conference at the Madrid Royal Palace, where the event was being held, which was a one-time peace conference on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Shamir procrastinated in confirming his invitation, being practically dragged into attendance, pressured by financial and geopolitical means. Ostrowski wrote that the Israelis planned a false flag operation in which they would pin the assassination on Palestinians. They kidnapped 3 Palestinian militants from Beirut, who were their scapegoats, took them to Israel's Negev desert, and held them incommunicado. But the rest of the plan was called off. The information leaked to the media, and in a syndicated column, Jack Anderson presented the whole story. So did Jane Hunter in her newsletter, specializing in the Middle East. The Spanish police received the names and descriptions of the 3 supposed assassins. They were never let out of the Mossad holding facility in the Negev. For more info, you can read about it in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs and antiwar.com. But considering after the Madrid conference in the fall that year, seasons past the U.S.'s successful Desert Storm in Iraq, and that H.W. Bush doesn't win a second term the following year, with Clinton being inaugurated a month before the Trade Center bombing, when looking back in that same time window to planning and conspiracy revealed years prior, with Nosair assassinating Kahana, the narrative that Ali Mohammed was ultimately Nosair's handler is also to be challenged, since there seems to be someone else who's been left out of the picture, and only briefly brought up by few authors and reporters pointing out the Masjid al-Salaam Mosque's history.
6 blocks away, the mosque where Mohammed Salama worships. Apparently, it is much more than just a place of prayer. Among the 300 to 400 followers, Sultan Ibrahim El-Ghali, an Egyptian-born Muslim who was convicted of trying to smuggle hundreds of pounds of explosives to the PLO in 1985.
Sultan Ibrahim El-Ghali was reportedly 47 years old around the time of his arrest in 1985. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1968. He is a wealthy Egyptian businessman who was a dominant figure and patron in the Jersey community. As a gold smuggler, he was a local fixer. He loaned everybody money, arranged forged driver's licenses for illegal immigrants, and arranged marriage licenses and certificates for those who needed it. He ended up owning a travel agency named Sultan Travel, which through it is where he ended up getting caught in a U.S. customs sting operation attempting to smuggle explosives and weapons to a PLO representative to Saudi Arabia in 1985. According to newspapers after the Kahani assassination and events in 1993, it turns out that Sultan El-Ghali is a cousin and relative to both El Sayed Nosair and Ibrahim El-Gabrowny. And not just that, according to Laurie Milroy and Robert L. Friedman, who had briefly interviewed El-Ghali, had reported that he was either a leader or founder of the Masjid al-Salaam Mosque in New Jersey. So considering the narrative that Nosair was ideally handled and designated by Ali Mohammed, or even spiritually guided by the blind sheikh for that matter, doesn't sound reasonable at all, considering that we have something glaring about Nosair's family background and mosque centrally in question that's obviously been overlooked, besides for the fact that Nosair had already been living in the U.S. 5 years before Ali showed up on the scene. And something else that also should be considered from what was found after the Kahani assassination, according to terrorism researcher and Islam Islamophobe propagandist Steve Emerson that manuals and instructions on how to hijack aircraft was also confiscated from Nosair's place. And strangely enough, on the morning of September 11th, while the Twin Towers were burning, minutes before Flight 77 struck the Pentagon, terrorism expert and former State Department official Larry Johnson was briefly interviewed on the phone by NBC's Today Show and had this to say to Katie Tour.
Back in 1992, there was 93, there was a Lufthansa plane hijacked from Germany, and it ended up landing in New York. And one of the concerns we had at that time was the possibility of that plane, under the control of a hijacker, flying it into one of the buildings.
What incident that Larry Johnson is talking about was actually on February 11th, 1993, just 2 weeks before the World Trade Center bombing, where an Egyptian-born Ethiopian national living in Morocco named Nebu Demek, armed with a gun, hijacked Lufthansa Flight 592 from Frankfurt, Germany to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where he forced the pilot to fly the plane to JFK Airport in New York, seeking asylum. The aircraft landed safely, and Demek, the gunman, surrendered peacefully and without incident, and was later charged with the aircraft hijacking by a United States District Court. However, the point being is that some officials were certainly fearful that this Lufthansa flight may have been targeting to crash into the Twin Towers back then, which would be indicative that our national security state knew something was in the works of a future terrorist attack of that magnitude, coming out of information gained from Nosair's apartment, or maybe even before. It would also mean that the discovery of the Bojinka plot on Ramzi Yousef's laptop from the Philippines apartment fire years later could still have been a very late forewarning or lucky discovery for the public that such a plot to crash airliners striking American targets was conceivable and a looming danger, unlike what the national security state may had already known for a while, or how they perceived themselves to the public as being oblivious or no way of having any foresight or advanced knowledge. And then when considering the earliest indication of the Twin Towers being a target comes from all the items and data law enforcement officials discovered and confiscated through the search of Nosair's residence too, again with Ramzi Yousef, one would still have to wonder further about his role as a professional mastermind of the Trade Center bombing, playing the part to fulfill this obligation 2 years and 4 months later after Nosair is incarcerated, without any written guidance of his, meaning that even if Ramzi Yousef was getting bomb-making tips from Ahmed Ajab and his manuals while incarcerated in an INS facility, it still would have been useful for him to have a map or blueprints of the World Trade Center in order to know where would be the best place to park the explosive-laden Ryder van in their attempts to topple the Twin Towers. And maybe Yousef, as well as future World Trade Center conspirators behind 9/11, had such maps and blueprints of the Twin Towers.
Arnold Booker was a New York City fire marshal serving the department since 1979, who also was a veteran in the U.S. Army as a Green Beret during Vietnam. By the mid-1980s, he became a reservist, joining the FDNY in Rescue 1, one of the oldest rescue companies in all of New York. On September 16, 1986, Booker was a young firefighter, responded to a 2-alarm fire on the Upper West Side, where he fell 5 stories trying to rescue an FDNY lieutenant trapped in an apartment. He survived this spectacular fall through 5 floors.
A courageous New York firefighter is in the hospital tonight, and he's in for a long stay. His back was broken, but doctors say that it's a miracle he wasn't killed.
Booker was not expected to live and could have retired on a $250,000 tax-free pension at the age of 32. But he vowed to return to the FDNY and Rescue 1, telling his wife Eve in the hospital before going into an MRI scan that he was going to go back to Rescue 1 within a year, which he did. Over this incident, Ronnie became a legend throughout the FDNY and was adequately nicknamed the Flying Fireman for that fall. But because he was doing paratrooper training as a reservist, he switched positions due to his injured back, which transformed his career by working as a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst. After responding to the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, Ronnie had a personal interest in investigating the matter due to the incident involving longtime friend and firefighter Kevin Shea, who had fallen 4 stories into the impact hole he inspected, created by the urea nitrate bomb in the Ryder van. The incident with Kevin Shea was dramatized and also played by George Clooney in the 1993 made-for-TV movie Without Warning, Terror in the Towers, on NBC, which was broadcast in May that year, just a couple of months after the bombing. Filmed on location at the crime scene while the B-level floors were still in ruin and repair, reenacting the events where the drama had just taken place, with FDNY and Rescue 1 battling the blaze.
Without Warning, Terror in the Towers, an NBC movie event, Wednesday.
The FBI had shut out the local fire department investigations who could have contributed to the federal investigation. So Ronnie then educated himself about Middle East and Islamic terrorism and began his own personal probe. He would document thousands of files himself. He told dozens of people over the years that he was convinced that there was going to be another attack on the World Trade Center again.
His specialty was terrorism. He was a very good investigator. In '93, he was in Rescue 1, and he went to the World Trade Center. He told everyone that the World Trade Center was going to be a target of terrorism.
In September of 1999, for 9 months, Ronnie was working at Metrotech, one of the more modern, secure buildings in the city, which contained plans for virtually all the major building structures in New York City. It was also the New York Fire Department headquarters in Brooklyn. One day in his cubicle, doing his paperwork, Booker overheard 2 fire marshals talking about an incident that occurred a few days earlier, where an FDNY accountant claimed to have lost his ID on a PATH train to New Jersey, but that there was something suspiciously wrong. According to the general rule working in the building, if you lost your ID, you had to tell fire marshals immediately, in which they did affirm that when they spoke to this accountant and asked if he had filed a lost access card report, the accountant said he did. But when the same 2 fire marshals came in the next morning and found the report card filed out, not only was there something wrong with the timing of the report, but it was signed by the name of a fire marshal who was also on vacation at the time of the signature. As one would obviously conclude, it must have been forged. But by whom? While the fire marshals were explaining the situation to Ronnie, they said the accountant was Egyptian. Ronnie became compelled to act on his suspicions and wanted to know more about this accountant and why they would go through so much trouble to get a new ID. The accountant's name was Ahmed Amin Rafai, who was a naturalized Egyptian citizen and an FDNY accountant for 25 years. On a hunch, Ronnie started taking a closer look at Rafai and went down to observe videotape taken of Rafai, which clearly showed that his reportedly lost ID card was in his back pocket when he was requesting a new one, and that later the security video showed him swiping his ID card through the reader and entering Metrotech. Rafai was interviewed later, but gave conflicting information to the supervisor. His ultimate answer for getting a new ID was nostalgic reasons. Ronnie wondered why an experienced, long-standing accountant would risk his entire career and reputation for simply lying over a lost card. Nostalgic reasons? Or something more? Booker continued to press forward as to why the risks Rafai took. Ronnie ended up commiserating with his boss, who was also Rafai's supervisor, Kay Woods, who is now Deputy Assistant Commissioner, and asked her what kind of employee Rafai had been. Woods in return rolled her eyes and said the guy was like a ghost employee. He would come in late, take every vacation, and fall asleep at his desk, and make calls to native homeland Egypt. He was like a non-entity in the department. Ronnie then asked Woods if Rafai had ever done anything unusual that she observed. Woods said that in the early 90s, prior to the first World Trade Center bombing, while the Capital Budget Unit was being renovated, where she and Rafai were located previously, and that there was a time that Rafai gotten hold of the blueprints to the World Trade Center. A large number of blueprints to New York City, more notable buildings, were kept in the inspection department located inside filing cabinets that were being thrown out into 2 dumpsters. When one day Kay was at lunch and came back to finding Rafai digging through the dumpsters and found the World Trade Center blueprints on his desk. Woods specifically remembered Rafai asking about the blueprints. "Can I have these?" At the time, she thought nothing of it. The day of the first World Trade Center bombing, Rafai called in sick. He then became extremely paranoid. Woods described a pattern where he told her he thought the FBI was bugging his garage. Ronnie then discovered from others within the fire department that the FBI had interviewed Rafai twice in 1994, but more specifically, that he had been seen in news footage regarding the mosques and 1993 World Trade Center and landmarks plot. After listening to co-workers and his boss's experiences with Rafai, Booker was aghast. It confirmed his initial suspicions about why Rafai was acting so irresponsible regarding the ID pass. Ronnie went to a local news channel where he knew a film editor he then asked to view some news archives. And after looking at the 4th or 5th videotape, he found one showing Rafai on the arm of the blind sheikh, acting as a bodyguard, moving him through the crowd while whispering in his ear. Rafai, seen here, with one of the most notorious radical fundamentalists in the world, Booker was astonished. Given his knowledge of the Egyptians and the role that they played earlier with the Blind Sheikh and the New York Landmarks plot and the first World Trade Center bombing, Booker was convinced he was an Al-Qaeda operative. Ronnie rushed this information of Rafai obtaining plans of the World Trade Center and brought it to the FBI in September of 1999. Agents at the New York field office refused to listen to his observations. One of the agents even told Booker, "Well, we don't see any crime here. There is nothing we could do." He was absolutely stunned at the refusal to even take his account seriously. But that didn't stop Ronnie, as he had access to information the public did not, and he intensely investigated more and kept a bird's eye view on the Twin Towers. 1 month before the 9/11 attacks, he visited one of the security guards at the World Trade Center and inquired whether there was any new means of ingress or egress that could allow anyone access to the Twin Towers from below.
Ronnie had made himself familiar with every facet of those buildings, how they were constructed, what was in the buildings, what were the weak points of the buildings.
After the bombing attack in 1993, he always said to me, they're going to come back for that building because they didn't feel that they did it right. They wanted to do a lot more damage than what was done. They will be back. They're going to come back.
On Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001, after American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. of the World Trade Center, Ronnie roared down lights and sirens to Liberty Street alongside his boss, Fire Marshal Jimmy Devery.
So I remember saying to Ronnie, okay, let's go. You know, it's going to be an all-dayer, you know. And we went down and got our gear. We threw it in a car and we just sped down. We drove down almost to the corner where the South Tower is. It got hit. That's when the South Tower got hit. And then we went along the building. And I remember I seen stairs, and I said, Ronnie, there's stairs here. And he said, no, follow me. And all I could think at the time was, wait a minute, I'm the boss. But you know how somebody says something with authority? It's the way he said it. We went to a certain stairwell, and we just started heading up. And I remember it was up in the 30s. One of the last things I said to Ronnie was, you're killing me, I gotta rest. You know, he was always a flight ahead of me, he's in great shape. But now when we got up to about the 50th floor, there was no more people coming down. And Ronnie was like 2 flights ahead of me. And I remember seeing this woman on the landing, and she had her arms out, and she was bleeding, and she saw the turnout coat, and she just did one of these, and and I had to grab her. And I remember yelling to Ronnie, I'll be back. I gotta take her down. Well, I started helping her down with 10 flights, and on the 40th floor, a fireman opened the door to the stairwell, and he said, I've got an elevator. You need it? I said, yeah.
Ronnie actually reached the impact zone of the 78th floor of the South Tower, along with Battalion Chief Oriel Palmer, who devised a plan to put out the fire. The 2 men were the only firefighters who made it that far, as both were experienced marathon runners.
Okay, 7, Atlanta 415. We got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Ready know that. 78th floor, numerous 1045 code 1s.
1045 code 1s means dead bodies.
Chief, what stair you in? South stairway, Adam. South Tower. 478. South floor over here. Numerous civilians. We're going to get 2 engines up here. All right, 10-4, we're on our way.
At the impact zone, up on the 78th floor, Chief Oriel Palmer and Fire Marshal Ronald Bucca stay to fight the blaze among the dead and the dying. Palmer again tries to reach members of Ladder Company 15.
Battalion 7, Ladder 15.
It is the last time anyone hears from either Chief Palmer or Fire Marshal Bucca.
But as the flames roared around them, and what the official story carries, the steel is said to have buckled, which led to an eventual collapse. Both men perished as the tower crumbled down to the bottom. Ronnie Bucca was the only firefighter marshal in the history of the New York City Fire Department to be killed in the line of duty. Fire Marshal Devery, who was with Bucca earlier, had rescued a badly burned woman named Ling Young on the 51st floor and got her to safety and survived. 3 days before the 20-year anniversary of September 11th, Fox 5 News Channel in New York did a special news piece honoring Ronnie Bucca, interviewing his wife, Eve Bucca.
When he was recovered, his turnout coat was found on a civilian next to a group of civilians by a staircase.
And she says the pockets of that coat, where he kept all his supplies, were empty.
And I realized he used everything he had to help with the civilians.
Author Peter Lance extensively documents the story of Rana Bucca and his discovery of Ahmed Rafai in his first self-authored investigative trilogy of 9/11, 1,000 Years of Revenge, International Terrorism, and the FBI, The Untold Story. Lance was able to get detailed and personal information from Bucca's wife and those close to him, and decided to continue investigating his angle by confronting Rafai. Sometime after 9/11, veteran FBI agent Joe O'Brien, with his partner, organized crime expert Andy Kunins, went with Peter Lance to interview Rafai for his first book and wanted to give him an opportunity to respond to what he was told. Rafai admitted that he had acted as the Sheikh's translator at his Zionist hearing. He admitted that he was a member of the Masjid al-Salaam Mosque in Jersey City and that he frequented the other two mosques in Brooklyn where the Sheikh used to preach. During the 45-minute interview, Lance asked Rafai 4 times if he would renounce the blind sheikh, in which he refused to renounce him. Lance showed him a video still of him next to the blind sheikh, and Rafai admitted that that was him, but he denied that he obtained the plans to the World Trade Center or that he had called in sick on the day of the 93 World Trade Center bombing. Rafai stated that he was just a member of the mosque and that he was walking the blind sheikh to an immigration hearing as his translator. Lance then pressed him and asked, "Well, did you know Mahmoud Abalima?" And he said, "Yes, I know him." "Did you know Mohammed Salameh?" "Yes, I know him." "Did you know Nidal Ayad?" "Yes, I knew him." "Did you know Early Nosair?" "Yes, I knew him. But I do not really know these men. In other words, I was only acquainted with them." At the very end of the interview, Lance asked him at one point, "How did you feel about 9/11? Rafai tried to fake a weepy-eyed kind of expression, saying, "I went to the park in the town, and I hold a candle for these people." Lance also opined, "He started to get like he was remorseful, but not for long, because I really pressed this guy hard." He had a subtle change into a saddened emotion, but not for long, according to Lance, as he kept pressing on Rafai about his relationship with the blind sheikh. After a few minutes, Rafai finally lost it and said, "Do you know why the FBI did not discover 9/11? Lance couldn't comprehend, but he responded to Rafai saying, "Well, that's what my book seeks to answer." Rafai said, "No. Do you understand what my people believe? This is not bin Laden. This is not the Sheikh. This is the U.S. government doing this for Israel." Lance looked over at the other surprised FBI agents, and they were all stunned at Rafai's statement. Lance said, "Let me get this straight. You are saying that your people believe that the 3,000 people were murdered by the U.S. government on behalf of the state of Israel?" Rafai made a final proclamation. "This is what my people believe." Lance just thought it was absurd, which resulted in the end of the interview with Lance and the FBI agents leaving the house.
It's likely Rafai must have been seizing upon all the wild conspiracy theories that were also afloat in the Middle East at the time, but also when considering timing and circumstance of when Bucca first discovered Rafai in September of 1999, already being 3 months until the upcoming Y2K 2000 New Year's Eve events, with the Millennium Plot thwarted at the Canadian-US border in Washington State, also having links to New York and the East Coast. But also 2 months before Bucca's discovery in July of 1999, consider the foreboding prediction that was revealed by the FBI ATF informant Randy Glass, who was involved in a 2-year-long sting operation known as Operation Diamondback on Egyptian arms dealers and legal experts, as well as a Pakistani ISI agent named Raja Ghulam Abbas, who on several occasions these dealers boasted to Glass about having connections to the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, and described Americans as the enemy. Abbas also said to Glass while at a meeting at the Tribeca Grill in New York on July 22nd, "We would have no problem with blowing up this entire restaurant because it is full of Americans," and after dinner walked outside the restaurant and pointed in the direction of the World Trade Center and said,
"Those towers are coming down."
If this was just a foreboding prediction solely intended about hijacked airliners kamikazing into the Twin Towers, how would Abbas know that plane crashes alone were going to bring down the Twin Towers? Furthermore, even conventionally blaming the demolitions on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden was a perfectly good option in the first few days after the September 11th attacks, considering that if the mainstream media had not devoted their efforts to promoting a fire collapse option, blacking out the extended coverage or reruns of the destruction of the Twin Towers, as well as blacking out explosive witness testimonies. But despite the mainstream media's effort to suppress, at the same time, they mistakenly reported stories about insider trading through European stock markets and shareholders by bin Laden associates, specifically on business and properties inside the World Trade Center, holding insurance policies on it, essentially profiting off the attacks.
German regulators have asked the FBI and CIA to help them with an ongoing German investigation into short selling on reinsurance stocks in the 4 days prior to the attack. Reinsurance companies are companies that are secondary insurers who take the big risks on a major disaster, for instance. And apparently German regulators were looking into whether a Munich reinsurance company, which holds a considerable amount of risk on the World Trade Center, was in fact sold short by associates of bin Laden. Now, there may not be an American component on this because it is not clear at all that the Munich Reinsurance Company trades on any exchanges here in the United States. But what would be an American component is whether they deposit money in American banks, whether there are American depository receipts for this Munich Reinsurance Company. There's also been reporting in the Italian press today that investigators in France and in Italy are looking as well at other secondary insurers in those countries.
All of which points to the certainty that the Twin Towers were going to be completely destroyed without solely counting on hijacked airliner crashes. Because neither side could have dreamed the official narrative that the Boeing 767 planes and subsequent fires would have brought both Twin Towers down in complete structural failures. If we, the American public and other officials, didn't initially think the Twin Towers were going to totally collapse, then neither should Al-Qaeda. If it sounds implausible that Middle Eastern suspects could not have been prepared or are experienced enough to organize and conduct a demolition operation on September 11, 2001, think again when there's plenty of items that have been overlooked when it comes to the first attack in 1993. As already aforementioned, with Trade Center bombing ringleader Mahmoud Abu Halina fleeing and was found in possession of a book on rapid demolition and destruction of buildings in his residence before being extradited back to the U.S. Consider the fact that another associate in his inner circle, the Sudanese Tariq al-Hassan, charged in the New York landmark plot, resided at an apartment at 390 East 8th Street, where one of the tenants there said, according to the New York Times, June 26, 1993, Afghan Wars Web Encircles a Militant Islamic Movement by Francis X. Kleins, that in the week following the Trade Center bombing they saw the blind sheikh visit the building 3 times, carried up the stairs to the apartment of one of a dozen Muslim families in the building. Another resident, speaking on the condition of anonymity, said that the building attracted scores of Muslim men several years ago during the Afghan war, and some told of their war exploits. You'd ask them what are their specialties in the army, and they'd say demolition experts, the resident related. Building managers stressed that the Muslim families were law-abiding, and they denied that they allowed the building to become a safe house for militants, as one resident complained. If resources such as demolition expertise and blueprints isn't enough, perhaps maybe inside familiarity or reconnaissance of the Twin Towers might make you reconsider otherwise.
The latest connection between the suspects in the most recent bombing plot and the World Trade Center is that the alleged ringleader of the latest group actually worked as a security guard there. Siddiq Ibrahim Siddiq Ali allegedly lists a job working for the federal government at One World Trade Center in the offices of the Federal Home Loan Bank in his resume. In that resume, he boasts he was responsible for, quote, monitoring electronic surveillance systems and traffic surveillance of the premises.
The main Sudanese conspirator, Siddiq Ali, should also be considered in the modus operandi ability, since he worked as a guard for National Kidney Security at the Federal Home Loan Bank on the 103rd floor of the North Tower from August 1988 to December 1990.
Hi, this is the Liberation Army.
The letter, which was also received as a voice recording from Nadel Ayad, was written on behalf of Ramzi Yousef's 5th Battalion Liberation Army and is signed by an Arabic-sounding alias. If our demands are not met, all of our functional groups in the Army will continue to execute our missions against military and civilian targets in and out of the United States. It lists a series of demands, including an end to diplomatic relations with Israel and an end to interfering with any of the Middle Eastern countries' interior affairs.
The letter, which included an ambiguous return address scrawled in Arabic, contains a typed explanation for the blast. It says, "This action was done in response for the American political, economical, and military support to Israel." It continues with a vague threat to unspecified nuclear targets and claims our army has more than 150 suicidal soldiers. The letter's signed Liberation Army 5th Battalion.
But according to the New York Times, December 15, 1993, a copy of the letter will be found in the search of Nadel Ayad's home, but within his computer files, an additional letter was deleted but retrieved by an FBI computer specialist where it listed further threats. We are the Liberation Army 5th Battalion again. Unfortunately, our calculations were not very accurate this time. However, we promise you that the next time it will be very precise, and the World Trade Center will continue to be one of our targets in the U.S. unless our demands are met. As you know, our demands were revealed to New York Times, Post, and Daily News. Perhaps not enough of a threat or sign for law enforcement or national security to have taken more seriously, when the intentions and motives are still laid out clearly that the World Trade Center remains a target, promising precise accuracy for total destruction, which is why from what we've covered in previous films and written work about the case of the 5 Middle Eastern suspects linked to Denko Mechanical and Magic Heating and Air having prior and unauthorized access to the Twin Towers just days before September 11th, and were arrested months later in Tennessee on a sting for fraudulent IDs, which was subsequent to the FBI's 9/11 dragnet. That case in Tennessee should make one reconsider the Port Authority more as suspect or needed inquiry rather than just leaseholders of the World Trade Center complex, which is not conclusive for implication in September 11th, since it seems common that most have looked the easy way out, rushing to judgment by implying Larry Silverstein as part of their conspiracy conclusion, which in winning the bid and in retrospect is late to the game since it neglects the fact that despite Silverstein's chosen ethnicity, he didn't own the Twin Towers in 1993 and neither in 1999 during the Millennium Plot. And coming back to the cusp and pre- and post-millennium, all before September 11th, what Rafai and other Middle Eastern insiders may have known, or not, doesn't absolve any of the Mossad apparatus that's been uncovered on the Jersey side at the bare minimal. But all sets of foreign and radical conspirators must be fairly analyzed or considered. And what World Trade Center janitor William Rodriguez witnessed on 9/11 and before is not to be ignored either. Because aside from the 9/11 Commission report, omitting his graphic testimony for explosives, they also left out that Rodriguez had witnessed Flight 175 hijacker Mohand al-Shari scoping out the building in June 2001, a couple of months prior to the attacks. According to what Rodriguez told New York Daily News in June 2004, under the headline, Janitor Tells 9/11 Panel of Brush with World Trade Center Thug. Despite the already aforementioned, it's not a surprise the details of this Rodriguez and al-Shari encounter are covered up, but it's more surprising that it's obscure and virtually an unknown incident in the research field and movement of 9/11 truth. But the bottom line here is that it would be gross negligence to ignore all of Rodriguez, just as it would be ignoring Peter Lance's story on Ronnie Bucca, regardless if Lance's total conclusion blames the Al-Qaeda network, because his pursuit to connect both 1993 World Trade Center bombing to 9/11 through Ramzi Yousef and the Bojinka plot is certainly one angle that this presentation has counted on. And similarly, like with the International Herald Tribune questioning the role of Josie Hadass, FBI spokesman Joe Valquit had put down Lance's story of Rafai infiltrating the New York Fire Department after his first book, 1,000 Years of Revenge, was released, saying that it's rehash of old stories, gossip, and speculation. And if you think the anthrax letters right after the 9/11 attacks is simply your instant inside job proof of no foreign involvement, you might want to also reconsider when it's a fact that it was also reported that anthrax was missing from the same U.S. Army Medical Research Institute laboratory in Fort Detrick, Maryland, right around the same time of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And not only was there controversy going on there 2 years before in 1991, where Dr. Ayad Assad, an Egyptian, had filed a formal complaint against co-workers including Dr. Philip Zak and Marion Rippey for racial harassment, in which subsequently led them leaving U.S. Amarid in 1992, Assad stayed on until March of 1997, which then budget cuts led to Assad to being laid off, for which then he sued the U.S. Army for age and ethnic discrimination. After 9/11 in October of 2001, the FBI called Assad in for questioning. It was also revealed that the FBI had received an anonymous letter, postmarked September 21, 2001, in which an alleged co-worker warned that Assad might be planning a biological attack. The letter was unsigned and computer typed. It stated, in part, that Dr. Assad is a potential biological terrorist. I have worked with Dr. Assad, and I heard him say that he has a vendetta against the U.S. government. Although in his defense, it was concluded that the letter was written by a female in which Marion Rippey was suspected to have written it, the FBI cleared Assad of these allegations and determined they were unfounded. But when it came to implicating Bruce Ivins for the anthrax attacks years later, Assad also said in an interview to the Washington Post in 2008 that not only did he know Ivins, but made the accusation that Bruce Ivins was a victim of a vicious plot. And lastly, if you think Building 7 is the smoking gun proof of a government conspiracy or inside job, you might want to reconsider, since a smoking gun also needs a dead body, which there is none when it comes to World Trade Center 7 at 5:20 p.m., despite all the Building 7 occupants, which included the New York FBI offices that had relocated there in recent years, before its location at the Federal Building where it was targeted in the 1993 New York landmark plot. Access to World Trade Center 7 would have been much more complicated given the limited occupants versus the enormous multinational occupants inside the Twin Towers. And despite also that Building 7 wasn't a symbolic structure riddled with foreboding predictions of being targeted as the Twin Towers after 1993, or that even other neighboring structures around Building 7 were still taller than it, and that since September 11th, there has been examples of prolonged building fires where the entire structure collapses, like the Plascow building in Iran in 2017, where also molten metal was discovered, and the following year with the abandoned St. Paul building fire in Brazil. Not that those prolonged examples are an apples-to-apples comparison to the short time interval with the Twin Towers, given the circumstances of forewarnings hours ahead that afternoon added with the surrounding perimeter and streets closed off earlier, in the certainty that Building 7 was going to come down, which is a circumstance not disputed by the 9/11 Truth movement and architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. For those still in denial, attached in all certainty that 9/11 is an inside job, a shadow government and or property management conspiracy because of the quick captivating ending results of World Trade Center 7, then it is highly recommended viewers get a second diagnosis from YouTuber Edward Current and watch his 18-minute short film from 2021, Building 7 Explained, Comprehensive Final Edition, for a clearer explanation than what NIST, Popular Mechanics, or any of the other official story defenders have poorly articulated.
The 9/11 Truth movement does not need authentic hijackers on the planes in control of the planes. It does not need hijackers on the planes who themselves, it does not depend on any hijackers or anybody else for that matter on the planes that hit or missed their targets. The official story does not. Well, the official story depends on the hijackers being in control of these planes and on them. But the 9/11 Truth movement does not depend at all. We're not blaming the hijackers. We're blaming the real perpetrators of 9/11. Who simply used those patsies.
This is also a reason for why those who've invested in 9/11 Truth, nobly or as truth seekers, and in many cases still going back a decade of activity, should reconsider continuing to support or contribute towards Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, Richard Gage, and or those affiliated organizations, and abandon their entire narrative as an alternative completely, and try to come together with individuals who are more reasonable and unbiased to better form organizations and groups with realistic messages and goals that has standards and puts victims and victims' families of 9/11 first. I may not have all the answers to these questions and problems, but as an experienced activist and consumer of 9/11 Truth from Los Angeles and Southern California, I can tell you what I do and do not know about September 11th. But I can tell you with all certainty why 9/11 Truth as a movement hasn't succeeded, is virtually inactive, and irrelevant. But in the meantime, until there are reputable groups open to the public to address these problems accordingly, we've come to an end and hope this expanded film series inspires other researchers and truth seekers to take more responsible and appropriate action and initiatives that still need to be applied in regards to September 11th to enforce accountability and prevention. And as a storyteller, I also need your support. If you want to get an early preview on next films as well as continual, original, and unreleased content pertaining to 9/11, then please become my Patreon to also get special updates and help financially. You can also donate through PayPal. Since YouTube has practically removed all monetizing features for most conspiracy theory and historical skeptics content, your help will help me in acquiring costly, unreleased archives from news networks to produce more film series, as well as other future potential publishing endeavors. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe to my channels, and also follow and subscribe to Adam Fitzgerald, the other geopolitical researcher and contributor to this film series, who's also a host of the podcast, The Darkened Hour. And remember, 9/11 is an open investigation, if you want it to be.
This is some kind of a major explosion here.
There's gas in the pump. Get the gas turned off in the street. That's on the way? Yeah.
Police separated. There's been an explosion in the garage underneath the Vista Hotel. I'm the only one here. I'm bleeding. I can't find anybody. And it's getting smokier in here, and I'm scared to death. You're at the hotel? I'm in the parking garage under the hotel. I'm the only one down here, and I'm...
Building collapse. Numerous people That's okay. Can you give us an ETA? Send numerous ambulances if possible, okay? Right away!
On the sidewalk.
Please view all the original documentaries and news archives whenever available. Also, visit the website's references, articles, literature, and especially read all the books sourced. All information sources demonstrated in this film is not necessarily an endorsement.
I got people killed down below in the explosion. I got smoke all through the building, man. I'm getting my butt kicked. I got 500 people in here. It's really tough right now.
Keep going. Don't go in the stairwell, sir. Okay, don't go in the elevator? No elevator. Okay. The elevator shouldn't be working. They are. Okay, do not enter the elevator.
Okay. Stop radio 1993 with emergency. Yes, I'm stuck in the World Trade Center, and I need to know whether I should go up or down the stairwell. No, stay right where you are. We can't stay right where we are. The room is filled with smoke.
There's plenty more down there in the lunchroom. Lena, I'm alive. There is a guy. There's people trapped.